A pleasant morning to everyone. Good morning. We also would like to welcome those of you who are joining in this worship service online. Welcome to the 10 o'clock worship service here in Zikaek. I am excited to continue with the series that we have started last Sunday. We entitled the series, Rise to the Challenge. And we learned last week that in the life of Joseph, he experienced a challenge, not when he was sold as a slave, not only when he was brought by the merchants to Egypt to be sold to Potiphar, but when he was rising already and he was already in a certain position in the household of Potiphar, it was then when he faced a different kind of challenge in life. And as far as the record of the scriptures, I think it was the first time that he faced such a kind of challenge. And I mentioned to you that realities in life would give us an understanding based on the situation of Joseph that there are challenges that would come, not when we are there at the bottom of our condition, but sometimes challenges may arise when we are already rising up to a certain better condition of life. In the case of Joseph, he faced the challenge of a temptation when the wife of Potiphar tempted him to lie down with her. And we understood that Joseph rose to the challenge because he lived a life having a God-centered morality. He had a God-centered morality that when he was tempted by the wife of Potiphar, he said to her, "How could I do such a great evil and sin in the eyes of my God?" Through those words, you would be able to see the very heart of Joseph. He lived a life with a God-centered morality. But you know what? The story does not end there. When he was victorious against the challenge of temptation, I was surprised because that victory led him to another challenging situation in life. And I would like us to think about this reality that there are times when we experience victory, it is the very moment also that we will be ushered in a different kind of challenge. You know what happened? We delve into the story again. Let us look at the book of Genesis, a continuation of the story in the life of Joseph. We will continue with chapter 39, verse 19, and we will end in chapter 41, verse 49. This is a long portion of the story of the life of Joseph, but we will not read the entire more than 2 chapters, but I'll read only a portion, and then I'll explain, and then read a portion of it, and I'll explain further. Genesis chapter 39, beginning with verse 19, and then we'll read from that verse up to verse 23 for this time. From the New American Standard Bible, it says here, "Now when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spoke to him, saying, 'This is what your slave did to me,' his anger burned. So Joseph's master took him and put him into the jail, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the jail. But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's charge all the prisoners who were in the jail, so that whatever was done there, he was responsible for it. The chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper." May the Lord bless every one of us in the reading of his word. As I have mentioned to you, Joseph faced the challenge of temptation, and because of his God-centered morality, he overcome that temptation. He was victorious. He was successful against that challenge that he faced in the house of Potiphar. But that success led him to another challenge. Because the wife of Potiphar having failed in the temptation that she did to Joseph, she manipulated or created a story that Joseph wanted to sleep with her, to lie down with her. Actually, if you look at the real sense, it was her who liked that thing to happen. But Joseph was accused of that. And because the wife of Potiphar, I think, was closer to the heart of Potiphar than Joseph, he believed the story of his wife. And because of that, Potiphar put Joseph inside the jail, in prison. You see, there are things in life that would happen that way. You know, it's easy to understand when a chain smoker becomes or bears a problem of a lung cancer. It is easy to understand when a person doesn't care about COVID-19 and he doesn't wear a mask and goes to a crowded places, and the person would have a COVID infection. We won't wonder about it. It is easy to understand that situation. It is easy to understand a student's failure if he does not study his lesson or doesn't attend his classes regularly. It is easy to understand, to see a disintegrating family when the head of the family, the husband, the father of the family is running after another woman. It is easy to understand that scenario. But you know what's hard to understand and to discern in this life is that if you are living your life in a righteous way and yet someone around you will accuse you of doing something that is bad. It is easy to understand if you are a worker of a certain company and you are dishonest in your dealing and later your boss found it out and kicked you out of the company, it's easy to understand that matter because you are doing something wrong. But it is hard to understand when you are doing something what is right and yet your boss would kick you out. It is hard to understand when you who are so careful with your health will be contaminated by the COVID-19 virus. Joseph had that experience. It's hard to understand. Why was he imprisoned when he was just doing what God wanted to happen? It was hard to understand and discern how can a person who was living a God-centered morality be put to jail for something that he did not do. You know what? There are times in life that we try to understand the situation, but it's hard. We try to get all the dots and try to connect them, but it doesn't make sense. Sometimes we try to trace in the past days of life before this incident took place. We tried to look for some points, but there are no points for us to see. And that's a reality that can happen to you and to me today. But you know what? When a challenge such as that would come into your life, how will you rise to the challenge? When you will be accused about something that you have never done, how will you rise to the challenge? When your family is breaking down, despite the fact that you are living as godly as you can, how will you rise to the challenge? Let's learn something so important in the life of Joseph today. So he was already placed inside the prison cells. He was there. But despite that scenario, we can read in verse 21 of chapter 39, the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor. Proceed further to verse 23 of chapter 29. The Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper. We could never deny the fact that God was with Joseph, that God was leading him all the way. And this is something that we also know. When problems would come, we say, I believe that God is with me. When trials would arise, we would say, I believe that God is with me. But from our end, despite the revelations of God, despite the display of God's hands moving in our lives, how do we rise to the challenge? Joseph was inside the prison, and while he was there, something happened. The Pharaoh brought into that prison also his chief cupbearer, and his chief baker. And while they were there one day, Joseph noticed that they had a problem. In fact, he approached the chief baker and the cupbearer. And he asked the cupbearer, why are you so sad this time? And the cupbearer said, I have a problem. I had a dream that nobody around me can interpret. And based on this scenario, I want us to notice what Joseph said in response to the statement, I have a problem, I have a dream, but nobody can interpret. Look at the words of Joseph in chapter 40, verse 8. The last part of verse 8. Look at your Bibles. Then they said to him, we have a dream, and there is no one to interpret it. The response of Joseph was like this. Do not interpretations belong to God? Hindi ba galing kay God ang interpretations ng dream? You would notice right away in that response that the mindset of Joseph is anchored on the God who has been with him all the rest of his life in the past, and which he believed also is there at the present time in that prison cell. That answer would give us the idea that God is the main point of reference in the answer of Joseph. God is the source of interpretations. And that is why he told the cupbearer, why don't you tell me your dream? And the cupbearer related the dream to him. In my dream, he said, behold, there was a vine in front of me. And on that vine were 3 branches. And as it was budding, its blossoms came out, and its cluster produced these ripe grapes. Now Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. So I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. Joseph, knowing that the interpretation of the dream would come from God, responded saying, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift you up, your head, and restore you to your office, and you will put Pharaoh's cup into his hand according to your former custom when you were his cupbearer. Oh, by the way, before we proceed, what is the work of a cupbearer? We seldomly hear this kind of position in our society. In fact, I don't think there is someone here in Zamboanga City who has a servant and he calls that servant cupbearer. During those days, the role of the baker or chief baker and the cupbearer, their roles are very important to the king. The role of the baker is to make it sure that the king will eat healthy, good, and delicious food. That's the main role of the chief baker. He would make it sure that the drinks that the king will drink are good for his body. But the cupbearer will serve as a filter. If the chief baker will prepare something delicious and something good for the king, it will not be eaten right away by the king because the cupbearer has to taste both the drinks and the food, so that the king will be protected from anyone who would like to kill him, especially food poisoning. So the role of the cupbearer is somehow prestigious back then because you gotta eat and sleep near the king. You have the chance to mingle with the king in his palace. But the problem is that if there is a poison in the food of the king, you will be the one to taste first so that he will find out if it is good for him or not. And if there is, then you will die, the king will survive. That's the role of the chief cupbearer and the baker. Now, probably, the Bible doesn't say about the reasons why these two were in prison, but probably there was a suspected conspiracy in the palace that someone wanted to poison the king. So probably there was a kind of story that happened that way that led these two individuals inside the prison. But while they were there, the cupbearer dreamed of that dream. And Joseph gave a wonderful interpretation to that dream. He was satisfied when he heard the interpretation of his dream. The baker also had a dream. When he heard the interpretation of Joseph, he said, I have a dream too. Look at verse 16. When the chief baker saw that he had it interpreted favorably, he said to Joseph, I also saw in my dream, and behold, there were 3 baskets of white bread on my head, and in the top basket there were some of all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, and the birds were eating them out of the basket of on my head. And then Joseph said these words, this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you, and he will hang you on the tree, and the birds will eat your flesh off you. So the chief cupbearer received a favorable interpretation, while the baker received a very horrific interpretation of the dream. I believe the chief baker was scared of what is going to happen. Probably he was praying to his God that this interpretation of Joseph is not true. But later, on the 3rd day, when Pharaoh celebrated his birthday, both of them were taken out of prison. The cupbearer was reinstated to his job, and the chief baker was killed by Pharaoh. In other words, what Joseph told them as an interpretation to their dreams came into reality. But when that happened, Joseph told the cupbearer, when you are out of this prison, don't forget me. Don't forget me. It's as if he was saying, don't forget me when you are in paradise. But human as we are, we forget. Human as we are, we make promises and we break the promises. Now that time, the cupbearer was reinstated already, and he forgot what he said to Joseph. He forgot his commitment to the one who helped him out of the jail, to the one who gave him the confidence that he will be reinstated. He forgot about those things. And I think this added to the tension that was experienced by Joseph. Not only that he was sold by his brothers, not only that he was sold by the merchants to Potiphar, not only that he was tempted by the wife of Potiphar, not only that he was imprisoned even if he was innocent, but he had this hope out of this baker, out of this cupbearer, but that hope was just devastated because he was forgotten. How many of you experienced a similar thing? That you were waiting for that someone to come as a rescue to your condition, but you were forgotten by that person. That was experienced by Joseph. How did he rise to the challenge in that situation? And you know what happened? We look at chapter 41. Chapter 41 verse 1 tells us, now it happened at the end of 2 full years. This gives us the idea that he was in prison 2 years, even 2 years later, na lumabas na yung cupbearer, andun pa rin siya. He was forgotten. But that time, at the appointed time, God had something. He was doing something for Joseph. And what was God doing? He gave a dream to Pharaoh. Because of that, Pharaoh called all the magicians and wise men in his land. You know, that time, kings had their own magicians and wise men. These people, particularly the wise men, they studied dreams. They study interpretations of dreams. They study the stars. They study different kinds of things around them. And they are called wise men. But the problem with these individuals, many of them got their ideas and power from darkness. And this was very unique this time because the dream of Pharaoh was clearly from God. And here is something that I have learned out of that reality. When the devil is doing something, God can still read it, God can still understand it, God can still interpret it. But when God does something and he intends for the devil not to know about it, the devil doesn't have a way to discern and understand what God is up to. God's power is beyond measure that the devil could never reach it, not even a half of it. Now, this was happening in the life of Pharaoh. And so nobody was able to interpret his dream. And this time, the cupbearer remembered Joseph. Oh, wait a minute. I made a promise to that guy inside the prison. And he said to Pharaoh, there is a guy, a Jewish person. And he interpreted my dream, and that dream came into reality. And that is why Pharaoh told him, you call this guy. Joseph was taken out of prison. This time he was in front of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh related to him the dream. And look at that. When he was taken to Pharaoh, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have a dream, but no one can interpret it. And I have heard it said about you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Now again, listen to the very statement of Joseph here in verse 16. His response to Pharaoh was this: it is not me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. It is not me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. When he was confronted by the dream of the cupbearer and the baker, you know what was his response? As I have told you earlier, God is the source of all interpretations. This time he was confronted by the dream of the highest authority in the land, and his answer is that it is not me, but God will give you the answer to your dream. A God-centered discernment. That's what I see in Joseph's life. He had difficulties. He had ups and downs in his life. He was sold. He was imprisoned. Yet out of these realities, he continued to live a life with a God-centered discernment. And so Pharaoh related his dream. In my dream, behold, I was standing on the bank of the Nile, and behold, 7 cows, fat and sleek, came up out of the Nile, and they grazed in the marsh grass. Lo, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly, and gaunt, such as I had never seen for ugliness in all the land of Egypt. And the lean and the ugly cows ate up the first 7 fat cows. And then he slept again, and he dreamt of 7 grains, good grains. But later in his dream, another 7 grains came out, ugly grains, bad grains, and these ugly grains ate up the 7 good grains. So both in these 2 dreams is a set of dreams with 2 different objects, but there is a similar characteristics. 7 ugly cows, 7 good cows, fat cows, 7 good grains. 7 ugly cows, 7 bad grains. The ugly cows ate up the good cows. The bad grains ate up the good grains. How would you interpret something like this if you do not have the discernment that comes from God? But Joseph had that discernment, and he answered Pharaoh. Listen to his answer in verse 25. He started with the word God. God has told to Pharaoh what he is about to do. God has told to Pharaoh what he is about to do. This is another manifestation that he had a God-centered discernment. God is the point of reference when he gives an answer. God is the point of reference when he ponders upon a situation. God is the point of reference when he imagines about his situation. God is always the main point of reference in the life of Joseph. And you know, God was doing something in the land of Egypt this time. He was revealing it to Pharaoh. And I'm fascinated whenever I imagine about how God was giving this idea to Pharaoh, because this is a favor to him. Because the interpretation is that these 7 good cows and 7 grains, good grains, they mean that God would give a 7 abundant years for Egypt. And I think that is the very reason why it is represented by a cow to represent the livestock and the grains to represent the harvest of the crops. And so, 7 years of abundance. But Joseph said, remember, there are 7 bad cows and 7 bad grains. And both of these bad cows and bad grains ate the good cows and the good grains. The idea is that after 7 years of abundance, there will be a 7 years of famine that the Egyptians will totally forget the harvest, the livestock, the abundance in the previous years because of the devastating situation in the year of the famine. So Joseph was able to interpret the dream, and now that he was able to make the right diagnosis, he is now giving his prescription. The prescription is that you need to install someone who's going to lead Egypt, that we will be able to gather enough stock so that when the 7 years of famine would come, we will not die and we will not have Egypt devastated. Yun yung advice niya. And you know what? As I was pondering on this text, it is really fascinating to imagine how God prepares. We are in this pandemic. Our senior pastor, Dr. Ira Lee Rosalita, never perceived this pandemic to come. I, as one of the pastoral team, did not see this pandemic coming. The elders, the deacons, the deaconesses, not any one of us here perceive about the coming of this pandemic. But you know what? Last year, looking at our financial statement at the end of the year, I would like to inform everyone that I think there are about 4 million pesos na excess natin from the previous year's budget. Never in the previous years na nangyari yun. I think last year was one of the most, I think not one, but it was the most abundant year in the history of ZCAEC. It was very unusual. But you know what? Looking at this pandemic and having that in the perspective, I am able to say that that was allowed by God, the abundance was allowed by God, so that when a pandemic that happened in this time today, we will not be devastated. I did not prepare for it. The pastoral team did not prepare for it. The deacons, the deaconesses, the elders, not every one of us prepared for this. But God prepared ZCAEC. And if someone would come and ask us, how did you manage in the midst of this pandemic? I think I do not have any answer except that God is the only one who prepared us. That is why we are not devastated until today. It is only God. And God revealed that kind of scenario in the life of Pharaoh through Joseph. A famine will come, but before the famine comes, abundance will take place in Egypt. And Joseph was careful enough. It is not my discernment. It is not my idea. It is the idea of the Almighty, and He is revealing this to you. That is why you need to appoint someone who will take the lead so that Egypt will be prepared for the famine. And what happened next? Pharaoh looked at his magicians. Pharaoh looked at his wise men. Is there anyone from you who can be that leader? When in fact, nobody among you was able to explain to me my dream. And after looking at them, maybe he evaluated who among them can be that leader. And he said, there is no one. And he looked at Joseph and he said, God gave this discernment to you. You take the lead. If I may borrow the Reverend Richard Rojas' term, the story of Joseph is a story of someone who can be described as from pit to pinnacle. How can that happen to a person? That can only happen to a person whose life is having a God-centered morality and his life is having a God-centered discernment. You know what? Your minds may be very powerful, but it is very limited. Your senses may be very powerful, but they are all very limited. We don't see things beyond what our eyes can see this time in this normal way that we do. Our brains could never imagine about something that we could not see yet. But imagine having a God who gives us this discernment. That's gonna make everything so different if your wisdom is coming from the Almighty One. He lived a God-centered, with a God-centered discernment. I remember a story of a certain businessman. His business was so much affected by the recession. His company was going down. He was walking one day in a beach. He was trying to figure out how things could be managed. How is he going? What are the things that he needs to do for him to raise back the company? And this is one of the realizations that he had as a Christian businessman. He said, Lord, I just have realized that you are not with me in the way I run my business, because you were out of the picture. But this time, my Lord, he said, I would like to make you the main part of my business. I would like to make you the main part of the decision-making process of my business. He made that commitment. He went back to his office, and inside the conference room, whenever he calls for a meeting, along with the rest of the team members of his company, of the leaders of his businesses, he gathered them in the conference room for a meeting to decide about a great and important matter for that company. And you know what? In the midst of that meeting, there is a vacant chair. And every time they meet, there will always be a vacant chair that nobody is allowed to sit down. And when someone attempts to sit, he stops the person from sitting down on that chair, because he would say these words, you cannot sit on that chair because God is sitting with us during the meeting. In the process of the making of our decision, we get the discernment from the one who has given us this business, and we will only survive, we will only thrive if we get the discernment of the one who gave this to us. I remember conversing with one of the businessmen here in our city. During the recession, the entire Western countries were affected. It also affected the Asia and even our city, and the business of that person was affected. He related to me one day he was walking there at Pueblo, in town proper. While he was walking, he stopped beside the building of that old Golden Bell in front of Plaza Persing. He was wondering, he didn't know what to do. And right at that moment, the Spirit of God spoke in his heart, saying, you pause for a moment and I want you to think about your God. He stopped, he looked up to the sky and said, Lord, shall I continue my business? I don't know what your answer is gonna be. But as long as you are with me, I would make you a great part and the main part of my business. I will make it sure that in every decision-making process, you are there, and your name will be honored, your name will be glorified in this business company. Until today, he is thriving. Until today, he is expanding even in the midst of the pandemic. And every Thursday, I go to his company for a Bible study. Many of his people have been baptized already. From that time, he made a commitment to the Lord. You must be a part of my business. You should be the main factor, the point of reference for the decision making that I would make in my company. Listen to this, brothers and sisters in Christ. I don't know what your challenges are today, but if you want to rise and thrive, don't forget to live a life with a God-centered morality. But add to the arsenal of a believer, a follower of Christ. Never forget that there is a necessity for you and for me. While we are living in a society that is filled with corruption, a society that is filled with injustices, never forget that you as a child of God, there is someone up there who is waiting for you to call him. Make him the main point of reference of every decision-making process of your life. Live a God-centered discernment. Live a God-centered discernment. Bring God into the decision-making process of your business. Bring God into the decision-making process of your family. Bring God into the decision-making process of your studies. In every way of life that we have, bring God in everything, because that would only lead us to a better situation of life once we live a God-centered discernment. Never forget, Joseph rose to the challenge having a God-centered morality, and he lived a life with a God-centered discernment. Don't miss the last part of this series next Sunday. We will be discussing a God-centered judgment. God bless us all, and a pleasant morning to everyone.